Thanks for tuning into Season 3 of the Forward Podcast, a resource brought to you by MeadowBrook Church. In this season, we're exploring the topic of missional living and how we live with an eternal focus in our community and around the world. I'm Daniel Doak, and I'm joined this season by Mike Mnimi, our missions pastor here at MeadowBrook Church. Today, we're discussing basic missions topics and terminology that's important that we understand as we live and minister around the world to other people.
That's right. So today, missiologists use a lot of these terms that we're going to throw out today, and I think it's important for us to hear it because it helps us understand the task of the Great Commission that's left on the world. So we're going to throw out terms like this first one, a people group. Do you know what a people group is?
Well, I have the notes in front of me, so I have a really good explanation.
Yeah, most of the time when you throw out something like that, most people, it's not a word they normally use. So that's why we wanted to come and define these. So
yeah, and I think too, like as we start with people group, we can really kind of think that as the umbrella for which all the other terminologies about people specifically fall underneath.
Yes, yeah. So when we're talking people group, we're talking about people who share a common ethnicity, common language, common culture, and worldview, right? Just in general terms, that's what we're talking about. So,
yeah, maybe even here specifically, I think culture is a key. You know, if you go to different parts of the states, you may have different ethnicities, but culturally they're pretty in line. That's right. In other parts of the world, the ethnic part is a pretty big delineating factor.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So you can go to Cairo, Egypt, right? City, 20 million plus people. They're not all Egyptian. And those that would consider themselves Egyptians in Cairo, the vast majority of them are Muslim. Some are Christian. So you would further delineate out, right? Christian Egyptian, Muslim Egyptian, right? Some of them, you could look even further into their ethnicity, and they're not all Arab. Some are what we call Nubians, who are from what they call Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt, closer to Sudan and stuff. It's a different ethnicity, right? And so those are further divides into that. And so I hope that kind of helps. Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, I guess if we were to look at our context here in Gadsden, Alabama, you say the people of Gadsdenites, I don't know what the term is, but then you have, Alabamians, that's a bigger people group. Right. Then you have U.S. citizens, and you can kind of break it down within those groups, but that's kind of the broader range for those areas that we're talking about.
That's right. And even within Gadsden proper, where people divide out into Glencoe, Hoax Bluff, Southside, Rainbow City folks, right? So, yeah, we like to divide up into our groups. And so people groups, thinking in those terms of ethno-linguistic, ethno mean ethnicity and linguistic being their language, those who share common ethnicity, language, culture, worldview, thinking in those terms helps us to define where the gospel can go without any barriers, right? And so that's why missiologists talk in those terms about what a people group is, because they think this is the largest group or subset of a group in which the gospel can go forward without being any barriers to it. And so when we talk about indigenous churches that are natural and native to people groups, an indigenous Egyptian church would consist of Arabic speakers. Why? Because that's their language, right? And just like an indigenous church in South America, it would be, if it's in a city, primarily going to be Spanish speaking, or if you're in Brazil, it's going to be Portuguese speaking, because they share that language in common.
So if we stick to the truest definition of people that share ethnic, cultural similarities, just generally there's some numbers out there that help us understand how many there are.
Yeah, so not everybody agrees. I've seen a wide berth of numbers, anything from 11,000 to like 24,000 different people groups on the earth. Two sources that I typically go to are Joshua Project and the IMB, our International Mission Board. And they have a website for their resources called peoplegroups.org. And so IMB identifies right around 12,000, a little over 12,000 unique, specific people groups on the face of the earth.
That's great. So kind of breaking that down a little bit, when it comes to missions, there's specific categories in that big umbrella of people groups that we're focused on, especially when it comes to international missions. Yes. So the first one we're talking about is unreached people groups. So it kind of is a little bit of self-explanatory in the title, but help us understand that a little.
Yeah, so unreached people groups, in thinking of missions terms, our goal in missions is to reach people with the gospel. An unreached people group is a people group in layman's terms that really doesn't have access to the gospel, right? So a lot of people, you hear this idea of, well, why do you need to go overseas? Because there's plenty of lost people here. Yes, there are. But when you drive through Gadsden, Alabama, there are over 80 Southern Baptist churches in Etowah County, a county of 100,000 people, give or take, right? Then we throw in the Presbyterian churches, the gospel-believing Methodist churches, and Pentecostal churches and others, right? You turn on the radio while you're driving down the road, and you can find Christian music on a number of different stations. Everybody's got 12 to 20 Bibles in their houses. You see Christian billboards. We have access to the gospel, right? We can watch it on TV. There are places all over the world with little to no access to the gospel. This is what we mean by unreached. And typically, missiologists agree on a number of like 2% of the population or less are actually gospel-believing people. And so when you have that kind of number, and it sounds very small, right? And it is. But they have little to no access to the gospel. So in an unreached area, you drive down the road and you don't see a church. Most of your neighbors have never owned a Bible. They don't see a Bible. They don't turn on the radio as they're driving down Karachi in Pakistan and hear the gospel being proclaimed. They don't hear Christian music in there. You know, you can go to other places, and we'll get to that definition later of the 1040 window, but you can go to these unreached people groups and they don't have the Bible. They don't have access to the gospel. And that's what we're talking about.
And so it's kind of a deeper layer. You know, the unreached is, hey, there's some engagement there, but little access.
Yes.
So there's even kind of a step further, and this is the unreached, unengaged people group.
Yes. So unreached, unengaged people groups are unreached people groups, but really nobody's known to make an effort to try to reach them yet. And that's because they're in the hardest places on earth, right? They're in the top of the Himalayas. They are so hard to get to, right? They're in that island on the south of India that guy got speared at. Remember a couple years ago, John Chow? Yeah. And he just had it in his heart, like, I got to engage these people group. Well, they killed him before he got to shore, you know. Those are the unreached, unengaged type people where they have no access to the gospel.
And generally, kind of like you were saying, we think of these as people that not just are unreached, like we talked about before, but they're just remote and inaccessible. So they're cut off from a broader civilization and society that we would even be familiar with throughout.
So thinking just some numbers wise too, when we're looking at, we talked earlier about 12,000 give or take people groups on the earth, right? 8 billion people roughly. When we're talking about unreached people groups, we're talking 7,300 unreached people groups, according to the IMB. And that's almost 4.9 billion people. That's over half the the population of the world. 4.9 billion is a lot of people. There's 325 million in the United States. So times that by 10 plus. And then you're going to get to the amount there is. And we're talking about unengaged, unreached. The number's less. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but it's less. But it's still a substantial amount of people. I think it's over 500 million people that are unengaged.
Like you said, it's a small percentage, but when you think billions of people, that's hundreds of thousands, millions of souls ultimately that are not impacted or connected in the gospel in any way.
Billions, yeah. That's a lot of people. And those are in the hard places. Those are in the scary places most of the time, right? Which brings us to our next one, the 1040 window. So I'll flip it on you, Daniel. I'm going to play host. Do you know what the 1040 window is?
Yeah, so I think as we think through the two definitions we just talked about, we think about there's a really central point in which we can target, hey, there's a lot of unreached people groups. So obviously you can find them anywhere in the world, but the 1040 window is where we kind of narrow that down and say, hey, this is a focal area where there's a lot of people that need to hear the gospel.
That's right. It is the greatest concentration of lostness on the planet as far as Christianity and the gospel is concerned. So it's I think it came out of the Lausanne conference back in the 70s, maybe even earlier. But it's 10 degrees latitude north of the equator to 40 degrees latitude north of the equator. And this window that encompasses North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, which is Pakistan, India, East Asia, China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, all those places. Russia's included up in there. This is where you find the home of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, communism, atheism, a lot of tribal religions even still. But you have the greatest concentration of lostness and unreached people groups in that window is what they call it. And that's why it's such a focal point for missions and missiologists.
Yeah, I think as we kind of finalize this episode, the last definition is worldview. You mentioned several different religions, and worldview can apply to religion or just generalized beliefs, but it's important that we understand the perspective that people have as we try to reach them.
Yeah, it is. So worldview, it's how we view the world. I mean, I know that sounds kind of lame, but that's really what it is, right? And how we process and think about how the world works, how the world operates. And then we live our lives out of that perception, right? And so you have a lot of major religious worldviews that dominate a lot of thinking, right? Christianity, of course, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. You have a communistic, atheistic worldview, and a host of others within. The world has always been that way, and that's how people have always, and cultures have operated because of how they view the world, which makes it pivotal for us to understand where people are coming from in their understanding of the world, so that we understand how can we engage them more effectively with the gospel, so in a way that they would understand and grab a hold of the message.
Yeah, as we wrap up, one thing really stuck out to me as I was looking through these, preferably someone listening to this today is called to reach an unreached people group. That'd be incredible. But realistically, most of us in the listening area of this podcast that's hearing this is probably not going to ever directly engage with unreached people groups. But the reality is, if we're engaging in ministry and missions, ultimately at some point our obedience can impact and will impact those in these areas that we've talked about.
Yeah. I think, we can engage with unreached people groups, though. They're here, right? When you think about it, there are 4.9 billion people within unreached people groups on this planet. And I say that again from earlier because I want us to hear it. I want us to feel the weight of a lack of gospel access around the world. Because we need to understand we are all called to be part of the Great Commission and making disciples of all nations. And yes, we're not all going to go to Pakistan. We're not going to go to Iran and places like that. Some of us may. Lord willing, some will. But the way the world is today, the Lord has also brought those people here. They are our neighbors in Gadsden, Alabama. I have met people from Yemen, from Saudi Arabia, from Vietnam, from China, and a host of other places that when you look at, they're all from they're all from this 1040 window. My next door neighbor is from the 1040 window. And I think that's an awesome thing that we have access to folks like that.
Thanks for tuning into Season 3 of the Forward Pod. And as always, you can learn more about MeadowBrook Church by visiting us at mbchurch.com or emailing us at info@mbchurch.com. Thanks for tuning into this week's episode, and we'll see you next time.